Dragon's Dogma 2 is finally out! Yay! It's been quite some time since I've seen a game go from so much hype to uh-oh. Now, I realize that this is a very new game, and a huge one at that. And I understand that many of you would like to know an honest opinion as to whether or not this game is enjoyable without spoilers. In the next few minutes, I intend to do just that. But afterwards, I will go into a deeper dive on my thoughts about the experience, and you should click off the video. Do subscribe on your way out. I mean, I am telling you to hurt my channel statistics for your sake. I have obtained the Platinum Trophy to give you as much of a comprehensive opinion as I can, and I think it's important to keep in mind that there's likely stuff that I missed. The game is huge, and getting a Platinum Trophy does not necessarily mean I've experienced everything. I just went a bit further than the regular player would. To understand why Dragon's Dogma 2 has gotten such a bad reputation, there's two things to talk about. The first is the poor performance of the game, particularly on PC. For disclosure, I played this game on the PS5, so I can't share first-hand accounts on that, but I've heard anecdotes from friends saying that this game really struggles, especially in larger cities. That being said, the performance on the PS5 has not been great either. It doesn't happen in cities, but during fights you can really notice the game stuttering. My opinion is, I think as most of yours are, that this is not acceptable, especially on consoles where optimization should be much easier to achieve. The second is microtransactions, because Capcom can't stop adding them to single-player experiences. Stop it! This has been a spicy subject. I've even seen talk about these things being pay to win. I am not a fan of these in any and all paid for games. I always ignore them and don't support it further. But I disagree with them being pay to win, and let me tell you why. These microtransactions can be split into two types. The first are physical items that you can use in gameplay, stuff like port crystals to let you fast travel more conveniently. These are things you can generally get in-game, and it is nice how Capcom clarifies that these things are also obtainable in-game. But at the end of the day, these things should not be here for a game that respects itself and its player base. Some of them honestly look like a joke. €2 for a pendant that maximizes affinity, which is as easy as gifting an NPC like 2 items. If you bought these things, the game is making fun of you. Then there's Rift Crystals, which are not a premium currency, though I would understand why you'd think otherwise. You can get them through pawns, much like in the original. I can see why they're more controversial. There is a shop that uses crystals exclusively, and if you want to hire pawns that are of a much higher level compared to you, they're not free and will require more and more crystals. Honestly, I don't really get the point of them. Maybe it's worth it if you really want to change appearances, but buying an overleveled pawn to carry you? Why? It kind of beats the purpose of playing the game in the first place. None of these things are pay to win or really attractive offers, but they are at most pay for convenience. Nonetheless, it is gross to see a game dissected like this into spare parts for some extra cash. It just takes the magic of gaming away. The only thing I was even remotely tempted by were the port crystals, because somehow traveling is worse than in the original. In terms of gameplay, the game is good. It carries as much as it possibly can from the first game while bringing it to a new era of graphics. Combat is flashier, flows well, and it's still really satisfying to fight gigantic bosses. Classes, or vocations, have quite a few changes, with some, like the Mystic Knight, unfortunately not making a reappearance. That being said, what the game adds instead is even more unique. It's something I think they did really well, with each vocation having an even stronger individual identity in combat. Just as well, there's plenty of quality of life improvements that are fantastic. Like, if you've watched my last video, you'll know that I did not enjoy Sorcerer because of several issues, and this game fixes those issues impeccably. I am genuinely impressed by how much they nailed it. The only bad and really significant thing I can say as a negative is that the amount of skills you can equip for some vocations has been reduced. It's done in favor of having another vocational ability, which is neat, but far too often I was like, man, I really wish I had 1 or 2 more skill slots. I would have much preferred them to find a way to keep them. Pawns are back and they're better than ever. They are more responsive to your commands, and are more capable in taking the lead to show you things they've discovered in other player worlds. They now also have specializations, stuff like moving items and equipment around to avoid issues related to over-encumbrance, adding an entirely new dimension to their support capabilities. Also, you can high-five them after fights now. 10 out of 10. But there's also this weird design decision whereby random pawns talk to you automatically. This made me want to avoid random pawns. I've no idea why they did this.
I'm attentive and loyal.
The character creator is possibly one of the most detailed to date. I mean, is there any other that lets you select teeth individually? I rest my case. However, much like in the original, the game does this thing where it counts your character's weight to how much you can carry. It's so weird, like going to the gym and saying that you've lifted 200 kg, but most of those are you. I'm not even that heavy, why am I fat-shaming myself? Although, to be honest, I do understand why my character has that problem. He does have to carry all that really cool stuff, love how it lets you play with scars and tattoos, and I'm sure that if you're good at it, you can probably make something awesome. I accidentally made John Krasinski, and he's an absolute saucebox, so I went with it. The world is beautiful, and it feels more worthwhile exploring this time around. There's loads of small dungeons to explore which have unique layouts and sometimes details. They also hide stuff behind fake walls, which are personally really satisfying to find. They usually give you some rare resources, nothing particularly unique or game-changing, or stuff that results in finding new things about the lore of the world. So in this respect, I think the game could have gone harder. Where the game does go harder is putting hordes of enemies in every crevice. If you just want to go from point A to B without any hindrances or fighting, you're in for a bad time. The monster frequency is just that frustrating. The story is... well, it feels rushed. It's the weakest aspect of the game, and personally, a huge disappointment. If you play it, you'll know exactly where my feelings come from. Its flaws are that obvious. I would also recommend that you make backups of your save. That's right. Singular, because for some reason, like the original, the game has only one save file. If you want to avoid glitches or accidentally triggering something you didn't want to, you're fucked. Overall, would I say that it's worth the asking price of 75 euros or your regional or platform equivalent? Honestly, it's probably better left up for a sale. It's fun, it's really fun, but it's not revolutionary, and in certain respects, it's a real letdown. This concludes the spoiler-free section of the review, so from here on out, it's all fair game. Here's the structure of the video, and you can also find these timestamps in the description. So, gather your pawns, grab your camping kit, and let me tell you how we are all of different vocations, but we could all be even more varied if one of us were a subscriber. Please subscribe. Part 1. A really strong start. Before the release of Dragon's Dogma 2, I played the original. It's actually the last video I made, in case you don't know. Because of that, the first Dragon's Dogma and what I didn't like about it is fresh on my mind. Despite me saying that I was quite disappointed with how I didn't enjoy it as much as I wish I would, I ended by saying that I was looking forward to Dragon's Dogma 2. I saw the potential and uniqueness. The vision game director Hideaki shared that was cut down due to time and budget constraints, and a decade's worth of feedback could only serve to help them make Dragon's Dogma 2 a standout in 2024. And let me tell you, when I started playing, I could not put the game down, because what the original lacked, the sequel delivered early doors. Exhibit A. The World. Back in Dragon's Dogma 1, my issue with Grancis as a setting was how it's just a faithful representation of a medieval fantasy world. It has what you would expect, like villages, castles and ruins, but it suffers from a crippling lack of identity. And I mean this both visually and creatively. There wasn't something I found unique or memorable other than the Everfall. Dragon's Dogma 2 is set in the nations of Vermund and Bakbattahl, two countries that are separated not only by a border but also culture. Vermund is home to the human race while Bakbattahl has the Beastrun, and the differences between these two are both physical in the environment but also lore. Vermund is a nation focused around the cycle of Arisen being created by the dragon, seeking the Arisen and crowning them as sovereign to lead their nation, because they are all about supporting them and their pawns in their efforts to slay the dragon. Bakbattahl, on the other hand, could not be more different. There seems to be animosity towards the Arisen, and towards pawns they're outright hostile. They're usually not allowed in the capital, their riftstone is outside the city, and the first few minutes of the game showcase a camp where they're all controlled and used as slaves. They are considered a bad omen, and they're not exactly wrong. If you know, you know. Visually, the devs really managed to set these two nations apart, with Vermund having lush green forests while Bakbattahl has arid canyons with little vegetation. But what I loved even more is how there's so many details that differentiate these nations. From ruins having different architecture and styles to more subtle stuff like certain types of chests being more prevalent in one nation but not the other. There's a lot of things to notice and appreciate. My personal favorite is how you can find this statue throughout the world, depicting a figure with a dragon they had just slain. In Vermund, these statues are defaced, literally, as the figure is decapitated, but in Bakbattahl they're not, and you can distinctly make out that they depict a Beastrun. This is great environmental storytelling. It hints at the racial tensions between the two races, the military tension between the nations, and serves as a lore piece because you eventually find out that the founder of Vermund was actually a Beastrun. This genuinely impressed me, like the difference in this aspect is night and day between the original and the sequel. Exhibit B. The Plot. Back in Dragon's Dogma 1, a huge problem with the story was that you get to the capital of Grancis, Gran Soren, and from there you just do loads of stuff that feel like side quests. Barely anything advances the story or is even related to it. In hindsight, this makes sense. It is revealed that the Duke is a fraud, as the dragon offers you to lead Grancis as an eternal ruler in exchange for sacrificing the character closest to you. The Duke took that deal, so it stands to reason that he would try to impede your progress by giving you meaningless and potentially dangerous stuff to do in a bid to remain in power. But this element of conspiracy remains unused, it makes for boring storytelling, and the Duke does help you out in the end. By contrast, Dragon's Dogma 2 fixes that immediately. At the very start, you're cursed, kidnapped, and sold into slavery as a pawn because the current Queen of Vermin desires to stay in power for herself and her son. From there, you do a lot of quests related to uncovering her conspiracy, win the people's approval, and gain favor with individuals of interest. I found it amazing how the devs knew exactly what the original missed and what they had to do. Kudos to them, genuinely hats off for knowing exactly what the story needed. Unfortunately, the hat will go back on once we talk about the story in a bit more detail in a future chapter, because just like me on a Saturday, it goes down hard. Let's instead take a detour to talk in detail about what actually makes Dragon's Dogma 2 great. Part 2. Vocations, and how they're fucking amazing. Vocations are a staple in the world of Dragon's Dogma, and they make a big return here with quite a few changes. What's immediately noticeable is that there are no 4-starter vocations because the Strider has been split in half. And honestly, it makes sense, they were a dual melee and range class and had quite a lot going for them. They're for the same part the same vocations that you know and love, bar a few ability changes. But when we get to the advanced vocations, here's where a lot of stuff changes. First of all, they're not unlocked from the get-go, which I wouldn't necessarily be against, but let's talk about how far you have to go to get them. Warrior and Sorcerer are locked behind a very early game side quest, which is fair enough. But the others are way further once you cross into Bakbattahl, which happens fairly late. The new Trickster vocation is pretty easy to come across, as the main questline will bring you to the NPC that unlocks it. The new Hybrid Mystic Spearhead vocation is just about south-ish of Bakbattahl, in an optional area which is what you'll likely come across even later, and the last two are locked behind an area that is so far you'll either miss it entirely or you'll find it right before you finish the game. Now, this is naturally my opinion. It is possible that you can find them much earlier if you're keen on exploring, or if you find ways to sneak into Bakbattahl before the story makes it necessary, which I think is neat. But this is how I think players on average will unlock these vocations compared to the amount of content that is in the game. I think this is a very flawed approach because design-wise you'd want to make them accessible or encounterable when there's a lot more content left. I'm not going to get into a new vocation when I only have the final boss remaining. Now let's start talking about these vocations by starting with the obvious. The Mystic Knight and Assassin vocations do not make a return. Ranger is still there, it's just been converted to the current Ranger vocation to be the exclusive bow user. And to be honest, it kinda makes sense. Looking back at the original, its main difference was using a different type of bow, while the dagger related abilities were reused Strider attacks. The Mystic Knight is unfortunately a loss. It may have not added much as a staff user, but it was quite unique with its mace and magic shield abilities, especially in how you could create bursts of magical elemental damage by countering attacks. It's a very unique playstyle that is not reflected by any other class currently available in Dragon's Dogma 2, and I'm sure they could have made an effort to keep it in. The Assassin vocation is also gone, and I think this is a clear indicator of a significant shift in design. The original had a lot of classes that could use a multitude of weapons and their respective abilities. This led to a lot of stuff being reused. Striders, for example, were able to use both daggers and bows, with each weapon having access to a different list of abilities. The Mystic Knight and Magic Archer had 3, while Assassin had a whopping 4 weapons and skill lists to choose from, none of which were unique to it. There was a lot of overlap, and while the flexibility that comes with it is a good thing, it also had the issue of running into a design problem known as, oh no, what do I use? It's a tedious barrier to entry in a mental sense because you'd have to dedicate heavily in deciding what to use specifically to make a class work. Dragon's Dogma 2 streamlines all that by making any type of weapon exclusive to one vocation. And while I realize that this comes at a loss of several abilities, it results in classes that have a far more pronounced individual sense of identity. But do these changes improve on the original, and do they make up for what is lost? Well, let's start by looking at the 6 classes that were in the first game, because they benefit from significant quality of life improvements that are genuinely fantastic. What's improved right off the bat is that heavy attacks have more of a purpose than being basic attacks but stronger. The game builds on its stagger mechanic, whereby using a heavy attack will perform a special animation, deal more damage, and as a warrior send enemies flying. Love that. This is a great addition to combat because your attention and fast reactions are rewarded. When it comes to mages and sorcerers though, their heavy attack functionality is completely changed, and that is fan-fucking-tastic. The magic heavy attack was the most useless thing in the entire game. For mages, Anodyne, the healing spell, is incorporated instead of the heavy attack. This is great, it's a fundamental support ability, and now you don't have to dedicate an ability slot to it. A huge positive considering that the number of abilities you can have equipped has been reduced. Another huge change is that spellcasters now don't have to overcharge their abilities, which immediately improves how active they are in battle. But the game does something more. It lets you speed up the casting time by spending additional stamina, and with another ability it even lets you store a spell for instant use. This is sublime class design. And sorcerers also get Galvanize, which restores stamina fast and helps a lot in managing it. Dragon's Dogma 2 goes hard in fixing every issue I've had with sorcerers in the original, and it's an absolutely beautiful thing to see. I was genuinely impressed, blown away, and got the happy tingles. This, however, doesn't mean that all spells can be quick casted. The natural disaster spells Maelstrom and Meteoron do make a return. They can't be quickened, and they also render you immobile, which I actually think is great. The game draws a more complex and clear divide between spells that enable you to be active and reactive in combat and spells that need cautious preparation. As for the new vocations, let's start with the Trickster. This is a very unique vocation that cannot be used by pawns, and the abilities make it very clear why. Essentially, the Trickster is a disruptor. They use illusions and smart placement to draw enemy aggression, they have spells to buff allies, even making them persist when reaching 0 HP, and can change the environment to impede enemy movement. It's a very welcome addition that, like the other classes, has a solid identity within combat. The only thing that is bad about it is that you're quite dependent on your pawns, since the damage you deal can be, well, I guess we can call it damage since it technically is that. Next up is the Mystic Spear Hand, another welcome addition that combines quick strikes and great mobility with magical range and melee components. It's quite possibly my favorite. Off the top of my head, the first ability has amazing range, is a great tool for exploration, and can even help you climb on flying enemies. Their base kit also includes an ability that slows enemies and can let you easily perform heavy stagger attacks. Their ultimate is basically Omnislash, and they also can get a fucking torpedo. One that is hard as shit to land and honestly could use some more work, but damn if it's not satisfying to use. One thing I really started to appreciate was the ability design, and I mean this generally, not just about the Mystic Spear Hand. Just because you unlock a new ability, it doesn't necessarily mean you get something better. It's about getting something different that helps you in other situations. As a warrior, I use the Skyward Sunder skill from start to end, because despite it being unlocked from the start, it really is a good ability. Lastly, we have the Wayfarer, which is the only vocation I haven't really interacted with. It cannot be used by pawns, and it's essentially that survey option that says all of the above. It lets you equip multiple weapons and can use any and all abilities from any vocation, and it even lets you equip any piece of armor. I think it fits well in the game as a jack of all trades, but I didn't want to get into it because it sounds like a lot of effort to make it work. It doesn't help that you're limited to 3 abilities, since one of them has to be dedicated to cycling through weapons. It's quite restrictive, but I'm sure people with more imagination than me could possibly make something broken out of it. And that's all of them. Overall, I think they've hit it out of the park again. They kept the original's design fundament of freedom and flexibility of choice while refining them to have aspects of combat in which they stand out. And look, I do feel for the loss of entire classes like the Mystic Knight and also some other abilities that didn't make it. The Lightning Whip, for example, doesn't make a return, which is a shame because it was a very unique and cool ability. But what they add is really solid. I've made the effort to try and play all of them, and I was honestly never disappointed, and the gameplay kept being fun. It would have probably been more fun if the game had a lot more story content to actually use them in. And don't worry, your time is coming. Now, one thing that Dragon's Dogma 2 does compared to the original is that for each vocation there's 1 or 2 abilities that are locked independent of vocation rank. And this lets me segue really nicely into Part 3. Quests. Dragon's Dogma 2 has a rather different approach to questing. The original, or well, I say the original, but this is applicable to every game released nowadays, always had an indicator to communicate directly that hey, this guy/gal has a quest for you. Dragon's Dogma 2 changes that by using a revolutionary technique called not having them. I feel like I will be in the minority here, but I actually really like this change, and let me tell you why. The idea of a quest indicator is something that largely goes unquestioned in modern gaming. But if you think about it, it is kind of a lazy and unimmersive way of bringing content to you. You essentially miss an entire chunk of discovery because the game doesn't encourage you to talk to its NPCs, it just shows you exactly who to talk to. Dragon's Dogma 2 doesn't do that. I had to keep my eyes peeled for NPCs saying stuff out of the ordinary, react to information I heard, then talk to specific NPCs to unlock new quests. I even came across a quest by buying one item from a merchant. This change made questing feel, personally, quite organic, and somewhat rewarding too, because I was rewarded for interacting with the world. It's the sort of unguided quest experience that Soulsborne games also have, albeit not to the same extent of vagueness. However, it does have one major flaw. It doesn't encourage you to talk to NPCs. When pretty much any and all people have a line like "don't talk to me, I'm busy," you start to ignore them. And that is especially compounded by the fact that they share the same voice lines. Nobody says something interesting or unique even if they don't have a quest. Like I said about the original, it's hard to give a significant personality to more than 100 NPCs. But if you're going to be ambitious about making questing feel more organic, you have to put some effort into making them engaging to interact with. I would honestly not blame you for thinking that Dragon's Dogma 2 has barely any quests because the game does a really poor job at encouraging you to find them. Another pretty obvious flaw is that they tend to be pretty outdated. It's usually a regular fetch quest, escort, or kill something somewhere. I'm not going to think badly of the fact that they are not always interesting or pertinent to the plot. In fact, I think they fit better in the world this way because you're talking to random people and trying to solve everyday problems. But they are outdated, like flying little bits of content that lack the effort of being engaging. One thing the game does really well compared to the original is that there's more complex interactivity between quests. There's more occasions where characters from one quest make an appearance in the other, knowledge from one quest helps in the other, etc. Like you have to free a magistrate but he refuses to leave unless you find some sort of library for him. Then in an entirely unrelated quest you have to find a child who disappeared, and it turns out that he discovered an underground library that was sealed off generations ago. So you can move the magistrate there. Then he can help you in finding a book that is needed for two quests that run concurrently. You can't turn them into both quest givers because a lot of the books they want don't have copies. At least I don't think, I only got the platinum trophy, that doesn't mean that I know everything. But if you know of a certain character, he can create forgeries just like in the original. This sort of stuff makes the world feel alive, interconnected, and immersive. One problem can relate to another, and putting them together creates a solution. It is unfortunately something that I feel is quite scarcely used. The last example is the most complex I can think of, and it kinda stands alone. And there are quests that I feel could have gone a bit further. There's one with a medical nun where it turns out that she was actually poisoning her patients to produce some sort of substance. You investigate who she's talking to, what that substance is about, and eventually just get her arrested. I would have expected a follow-up to find out what they're doing with it, or at least to try and sabotage their warehouse or something. I definitely think it's a loss on how many stories could have been told that way. And come to think of it, the main story barely makes use of this principle, which is a shame, cause, you know, it's the main story, the primary spectacle of the game. Oh, your time is still fucking coming. I am happy that they are able to showcase a higher level of complexity to quest design. It's just that the density of it is quite light in a game this large. And I also think it's a great move to encourage questing by hiding some abilities through it. They are really worth seeking out. Mages get a huge AoE that basically gives you infinite stamina, sorcerers get the end of the world, and magic archers get an ability that consumes health but becomes so strong that it straight up deletes everything. And I mean everything. This ability is seriously broken, and with a few wake stones or all heal elixirs you can pretty much body any threat. And I love it, I am so happy they decided to keep all of this broken shit. Feeling powerful feels fantastic, and that's exactly what this game does perfectly. Oh, I can't move forward before telling you one anecdote about a certain quest. So you find this bistron who was tasked with returning an important item which got stolen. He fears for his life because he thinks his employer will kill him, so he wants to sell it and escape. Then you meet a human who works for the same guy who also wants to same thing. This is the first time I got to use forgeries. I gave the real one to the bistron and the fake to the other guy. But uh-oh, he wants to audit the item to make sure it's the real one. Busted, right? Well, it turns out that the guy who does the auditing is the same guy who makes the forgery. And you have to bribe him to convince himself that his own forgery is real. He doesn't even remember making it for you. What I'm trying to say is that the attention to detail is still not there yet. Now, let's talk about part 4, the world for a second because I have some things to say. First things first, the game adds camping, a feature I found out about in the first place because of the microtransactions, which is great. Now I love the idea of camping in games. If you add camping to your game, it immediately reinforces the idea of adventure for me, I'm just that simple. This time around, the loss gauge, the amount of HP you can recuperate, cannot be healed through consumables. This makes camping intrinsic to your adventure as the only way to restore fully on the go. And you can also cook meals to improve your stats with each dish featuring a different cutscene. You can even tell if you're cooking something rotten, which is just a chef's kiss of a detail. In terms of traveling, the game maintains its stance on heavily limited fast travel. This time, it adds an ox cart service as a means of accessible fast travel to towns and villages, which I do appreciate, and I think it complements the game aesthetically and functionally. The only annoying thing is how you can get ambushed and it often leads to the cart getting destroyed. You'll then have to walk for the rest of the way, which kinda defeats the purpose of it in the first place. Fast travel is still facilitated by port crystals and fairy stones, and while I think that the detail of throwing a fairy stone and it not working because you're in a cave is fun, the overall thing is quite questionably designed. Compared to the original, I feel like port crystals are even rarer, while the world is much bigger. And this is very much exacerbated by the amount of port crystals placed in the world by default. Again, there's only two of them, one in Vernworth, the capital of Vermund, which makes sense, and then another one, not in the capital of Bakbattahl, but in a random village with no real lore importance. The only reason I can imagine they put it here is because there's no ox carts going to and from it, and later there's a main quest you can access from here. But this is how it looks on the map. Two port crystals really close nearby and the rest of the map can go get fucked. In terms of actually exploring by foot, I really have a huge grievance. I stand by what I said in the beginning. In terms of worthwhile things to explore, the game is miles ahead compared to its predecessor. But one thing I said about the original is that the overworld of Grancis is just populated by random monsters and kinda nothing else. This was originally a problem vis-a-vis the fact that there are no engaging encounters in the world, and Dragon's Dogma 2 shits the bed here in spectacular fashion. You only have random NPCs that are under attack or need you to escort them somewhere, essentially randomly generated encounters that hold no special meaning. But the greater issue this time around is the monsters. The world is so overpopulated, it's insane. You can barely make 5 steps before a new group of monsters appears. It's so damn full of them that sometimes when you fight a larger monster, another one nearby just joins in. These hordes upon hordes of enemies can run the risk of making you engage with the idea of exploration less likely, which is a shame. There's a lot of cool hidden stuff, like an elven village where they speak their own language, a hot spring area with sentient folk that knows exactly what to cover.
Tell us your dick!
Groups and groups and groups of enemies upon enemies don't encourage exploration, they cause fatigue, and you can bet I felt that at many points in the game. And because the game likes throwing enemies in your face so much, let's talk about enemy variety, because holy shit. So you've got goblins, hobgoblins, harpies, saurians, wolves, bandits and slimes. At night you've got skeletons, zombies, specters and liches.
Oh wait a minute, bitches.
Then you got the larger boss-ish monsters. Griffins, cyclops, trolls, golems, chimera, dragons, and subspecies, Medusa, minotaurs and Dullahans. Let's play a game. How many of these are not from the first Dragon's Dogma, as in fully original to this game? I'll give you 3 seconds. Pause the video if you feel like taking this seriously for whatever reason. The answer is 4 out of 20. The ones that were in the original are functionally the same, even down to seemingly reusing most animations, and some of the new monsters are damn near hard to find. Dullahans I just couldn't find till I hunted one down in the endgame, while Medusas seem to spawn only in one cave. To their credit, I love the Medusa. You can chop off its head and use it to petrify enemies, even large ones, and even Medusa herself. Another cool interaction is how you can make Cyclopsi, fall over and form a bridge, and now you can also hold on to flying enemies and go with them. But if you're telling me that this is where 12 years worth of creative thinking, unused ideas and planning went into, holy shit, it's not nearly enough. It's honestly quite disconcerting to look back at the original and see how these issues still hold up in the sequel. And this brings me to Part 5, Lack of Character. Again, back in Dragon's Dogma 1 there was a serious lack of character. Dragon's Dogma 2 does barely anything to address that. 99% of NPCs have nothing but generic voice lines, a handful have one-dimensional personalities, and then there's a few with around 1 minute where they get to shine. This time I actually feel like there's less of that even. Like, the only memorable one happened to be Phases. It's revealed that he's aware of the Arisen Dragon cycle and his villainous efforts are to put a stop to it. He inevitably fails, but afterwards becomes sort of an ally as you try to save the world. No other character really has this level of nuance and complexity. And this is not to say that Phases is some sort of masterstroke in character design. He just goes from villain to ally by happenstance. frankly, the Sphinx, a beast with one of the coolest quests in the game, has more personality than anyone. The way she looks at you and the way the sound swirls in anticipation of revealing whether you're right or wrong is just brilliant. This smile, right here, conveys character that 99.9% of these NPCs can only dream to have. And it's also much better in terms of NPC facial expressions, come to think of it. Like, during cutscenes everything looks great, but when you talk to people they just rigidly stand there, and sometimes the game makes the mistake of zooming into their face, which just shows how mechanical their reactions are. It's like someone flicks a switch. The affinity system makes a return, remember that? That really cool system? I don't. It works in pretty much the exact same way. You can gift various stuff to people or do quests for them to like you. A huge improvement is that some characters will also hate you for doing some quests or completing them in certain ways. Could you imagine how silly it would be if you were to say break into the castle, be arrested by the king, get thrown in jail, and then have absolutely no one react to you in any way after you break out? How stupid would that be? But the weird quirk of this system is how characters can hate you so much they straight up attack you, which immediately results in a mandatory meeting with God. In the several cases this happened, it didn't even make sense. Like, I helped rescue a beastern from a cave of Saurians, but the Elder is not happy that he angered the monsters and banishes them. After that cutscene is done, he just starts attacking me, and it goes as well as you could expect. The climax of the affinity system is again what happens at the end, as the dragon takes the person with the highest affinity and gives you a choice. Sacrifice them and hold a position of power as an immortal being, or fight it. It's the exact same idea from Dragon's Dogma 1, but 90% less dramatic. I mean, they just appear in his hand and... Wait, hold on, who's this guy? Is this? Right, he's a random NPC involved in the main quest. I've no idea how I ended up with him because I literally did not talk to him outside of the quest. It's not necessarily an indicator of the affinity system choosing this sacrifice poorly again, as much as it might just be me not being interested in the characters of this game. Remember, 99% of them have generic voice lines. They don't have anything special to say other than leave me the f*** alone. Why would I choose to build affinity with this character? Or this one? The only real benefit is transactional, they sometimes give you gifts. In fact, on the credit scene, my top 3 affinity characters are the ones who give you special vocation skills, because the game simply could not get me to interact with its affinity system in any way that isn't transactional. It's a huge letdown, and to a large extent the same problem I had with the original. Another interesting facet of character interaction this game has is stealth. Well, I say interesting, it's as interesting as any game that tries having a stealth mechanic in a game not built for it. It's a spectacular mess. Stealth is particularly used in a few of the quests where you have to sneak into Vernworth Castle. It's insanely clunky, with guards either barely noticing you when you're in front of them, and somehow detecting you while you're behind them. It's a mechanic of extremes that works like butter. Butter that slides off a fucking cliff. It's such an amateur implementation. I remember going in the castle prison to free the magistrate, and I was just unlocking cell after cell while the guards would just ignore me. I was in their face doing something illegal until at some point the AI just realized that maybe they shouldn't let me do that. So they just started attacking me all of a sudden and imprisoned me. But for some reason they left the jail key with me, on my person. I can just get back out. And don't get me started on how you get your equipment back. You just exit the jail and it's teleported into your inventory. I've no idea why the fuck they decided to leave this in. It's something you encounter very early and it's such a poor look for the quality of the game. Word to the wise, if you can't do stealth mechanics, don't do stealth mechanics. Another thing the game tries to be is more of a simulator where any character can die. It's the sort of thing that is great if, much like any emotionally balanced person, you'd want to see if you can complete the game by killing everyone. Any character can die by being attacked by monsters in the outside world. Sometimes wolves, goblins, even drakes can invade cities, which is really cool. There's an additional risk of cities being devastated, which is quite immersive. There's even an illness that pawns can get. It's the one thing they seemingly can't shut up about, but you should take it very seriously and really look for its symptoms, because if you don't, well, my pawn didn't just go on a rampage, he nuked around half of the population of the Bakbattahl capital, including someone needed for the main quest. I really like this. No, I really do. I fully realize that I may be in the minority here, and if you feel otherwise, I totally understand. It can screw up your save file and potentially make you use lots of wake stones to repair all that damage. But for me, there's something special about having my gameplay be affected in a unique and major way. I didn't pay attention, and many people in the world paid the price, and I felt bad. Or at least the game intended me to. The flaw, unfortunately, is that NPCs just don't have a personality. I am meant to look at all these coffins my pawn filled and feel like the world is smaller, having lost so many people. But when most NPCs do nothing for the experience, this design falls flat. Rather than be this life-changing event in your adventure, it becomes a sick spectacle of how many NPCs the game is comfortable killing. And it's comfortable killing a lot because any NPC can be brought back from the dead. This does make the concept of death feel diminutive, but if they were to choose between making the world and quests reactive to character deaths or just reviving them if you need to, you can bet they'll not go for the one that implies a lot of effort. Death is so insignificant, people don't react to it. You could get into a fight and kill loads of guards, no one reacts to that. Your pawn can kill half the population of a capital, nothing changes. You could even kill the queen or other important figures or vendors and the game revives them for you. The game itself undermines this mechanic. And I gotta tell you how funny it is to revive someone only for them to have so little to say for themselves that they just default to saying something like, "Oh gee, thanks," and then they just fuck off to find a personality.
Kudos for saying that, for spilling.
It is wild to look at this game, look at the original, and have something damn near identical to say about it.
Kudos for saying that, for spilling.
Again, I see what they try to do with these systems, I just don't think there's enough effort to actually make them work. 12 years. For this. For the exact same thing. Part 6. It's time. I've said quite early on that I found the story to be very promising, and I stand by that. It's a major improvement to the original, the devs knew exactly which scratched the itch. So, why have I been alluding to it being bad for the past 20 minutes or so? Let's review. You have to uncover the conspiracy between the current regent queen and the false arisen who replaced you. You investigate their origins, gain the favor of important individuals and the people, try to confront the false arisen during his coronation, plot twist, he has something that controls pawns much like an arisen does, so you backtrack. This is the point where the story sends you to Bakbattahl to investigate the pawn control thing. And I think, great, I'm at most halfway through the story, right? I mean, there's an entire new continent to explore with its own culture and problems, right? There has to be so much more, right? I'm now going to show the main missions on screen in order. This is the one that sends you to Bakbattahl. Mathematically speaking, there's only 33% of the story left, and that last bit goes by so fast it feels like you're stumbling across the ending. It just feels like there's an entire chunk of the story missing, with Bakbattahl being criminally under-focused. There's one moment where a person close to the High Priestess tells you that she wants to make the people of Bakbattahl more welcoming to pawns. Their cultural status as an omen makes people behave unfairly to them. This is a decent perspective to follow plot-wise, but it's just not there. The only significant thing I came across in Bakbattahl about the priestess is preventing her assassination. It's why I think that so many players feel like the ending of the game is so sudden, because you'd expect there to be so much more content here. I even bought a Beastern mask hoping to see if encounters change or get more nuance, and I got to use it only once, for a single line change. There's one more secret section of the game if you use the God's Bane while you're next to the Dragon's Heart, and the reveal to this is, to be honest, fucking amazing. The camera pans upwards to show the devastated state of the world, the music intensifies, and then it reveals the title card. And then you're like, oh shit, the title screen never said Dragon's Dogma 2. It's such a cool reveal, and it made me think, oh wow, this must be where the real game starts. Right? Welcome to the last 5% of content the game has. Yes, there's new stuff to explore because the water is completely gone, but other than enemies but more powerful, there's not much there and you're likely sick of fighting by now. What's worse though is that the game doesn't encourage exploring the world in its current state. If you take too long, huge chunks of the world become unavailable one by one. This is not to say that the concept isn't cool, it's a great act to close the game, but putting entire new areas to explore against a time constraint combines two contradicting game design facets. And what's worse is that it doesn't matter. The finale doesn't seem to be affected by how many of these places or people you save, it plays all the same. In fact, in much the same way, the brilliant first act, the one where you do quests to uncover and fight the Vermin conspiracy, is also rendered useless. Nothing fruitful comes out of what you did because whether or not you fight the dragon, you become the sovereign anyway. There's no conspiracy to dismantle anymore, everything just solves itself. Dragon's Dogma 2 is so committed to making its story trash that it even throws away its most promising bit in the most disrespectful way. Do you know that meme of the horse drawing that gets less and less detailed to the point of becoming a caricature? It perfectly exemplifies the story of this game. Act 1, Act 2, Secret Act 3, thanks for buying. Another thing I want to talk about is the loss of agency in making decisions in a game where your decisions should matter. So, in the final act of the game, you have to pursue Phases to the tower, when a massive construct emerges from the sea and starts pursuing him as well. The moment I found out that you can hop on its head and ride it, I decided to do what I do in real life, which is to sit on it and see where it goes. But here's where the game does something that is, in my opinion, incredibly stupid. Dragon's Dogma 2, a game in no small part about you making your own decisions, makes a decision for you. It decides that the construct is your enemy, and it decides that you have to destroy it. It makes no sense. It's not after you, it's after the same person you are pursuing. I decided that I'm going to ignore what the game tells me to do and see where it goes. I mean, maybe it leads to a neat interaction where it climbs the tower and changes the encounter with Phases. Well, if you don't destroy it, the game does it for you. This game has so many tools that it can use to make a unique story experience, and it pisses them away. This loss of agency and poor writing is something particularly prominent in the last part of the game. You have to collaborate with the enemy to make the Godsbane work. They at no point question who you are and what you're doing in their base. You just give them the sword, the crystals needed to make it work, and from there the guy intends to personally hand it to Phases. It's really weird writing where these things don't make sense, and you'd probably want to choose doing something different rather than have the risk of enemies getting this strong artifact. The writing is so poor in fact that the Seneschal makes an appearance to make this guy give you back the sword. That's right, he's back! Dragon's Dogma 2 is far more self-aware of the grand cycle of the world. I mean, the Seneschal, called Pathfinder this time, makes an appearance in the first 5 minutes. An hour and 5 minutes if you didn't create your character beforehand. For context, the original establishes the cycle as follows. Dragon chooses to make someone into an Arisen. Arisen must eventually confront the dragon. Arisen declines, sacrificing their beloved, and wins. Arisen confronts the Seneschal and challenges them for the status of godhood, and from there, the cycle repeats. The Seneschal was one of the last things you see in Dragon's Dogma, and this time around it's one of the first. Dragon's Dogma 2, in being more self-referential to the cycle, actually reminds me of Dark Souls. Spoiler alert here, but I'm honestly sure that most of you have already played this series or watched a VOD video on it. There's quite a few callbacks here, and no, I'm not counting the armors and weapons. The game already reuses aggressively most of its monsters, so I'm not counting reusing more assets as a positive. The thing that I really liked though is when a shrine rises from the water. You find the founder of Vermund all ghost mode on what seems to be the seat of the Seneschal. Wait, does it mean that he's the Seneschal? There's a lot of continuity problems here, and when you go up you actually realize slowly that you're in the same castle from Gran Soren. That's right, you were actually in Grancis all along. It's a reveal that really brought me back to discovering Anor Londo in Dark Souls 3. It's naturally not on the same scale. I mean, Anor Londo had a huge significance in the story as the city of gods, while Gran Soren Castle is just a random castle. But it's used to great effect to convey the age of the world. So long has passed between these two games that the capital of a long-forgotten nation now lies underwater. The same happens with Moonglint Tower, being the Blue Moon Tower from the original. What the game misses, however, is understanding that things don't just happen in a cycle. In Dark Souls, its own version of a cycle tends to be more tragic, with massive losses of people and spanning for longer amounts of time. It's far more likely for things to be lost or forgotten, but despite that, things don't just happen within the cycle, but also around it. For example, some covenants like the Warriors of Sunlight and Way of the Blue are allegiances and accords that have persisted across cycles. They transcend the cycle and directly affect it as people across worlds collaborate to push forth and achieve their goals. It may be a group that is strong enough to persist through time or an ideology born out of the human need for companionship. It doesn't matter, it perseveres and adds flavor and character to the cycle itself. Then you also have groups that scheme for ages, waiting for the right time to disrupt the cycle. The Pilgrims of Londor are a great example, possibly having ties to the first game's New Londo. They want to claim the first flame that sustains the cycle for themselves. This is the sort of advanced storytelling that makes me want to waste hours watching VOD. Whether the similarity between the Soul series and Dragon's Dogma 2 is purely coincidental or not, the game doesn't seem to capitalize on that style of storytelling even though it's a low-hanging fruit. The Moonglint Tower is so much larger than the Blue Moon Tower from the original. Imagine they justify this by saying that different nations have tried developing it further and further. Maybe they also tried to gain control of the dragon by building upwards towards the heavens, and bam, there you have an explanation as to why Phases thinks he can control the dragon. Sometimes it's just that easy. And it's not like the game doesn't tackle that idea. The original had you meet Arisens from ages past, and this one does too with the Dragonforged, a character suspiciously similar to the Dragonforged from the first game, but they don't contribute to the cohesion between cycles, they just feel constrained to the current one. Now, let's talk about the end, because the game shits the bed spectacularly. With the game being more referential about its cycle and characters trying to break it, you get the idea that it wants to build on the ending of the original. Let's go back to Dark Souls for a second. The end of the first game has you choose between relinking the fire, continuing the cycle, or walking away and letting it fade. It's an ending that, in retrospect, doesn't really matter. You may choose to walk away, but someone else might relink it in your stead. This cements that one way or another the cycle continues, it's not something you or the world itself can escape. Dark Souls 2 keeps the same endings because it doesn't have much to say for itself, but Dark Souls 3 has 4 separate endings, 5 if you count the DLCs. Only one of them continues the cycle while the other 4 offer some finality to it. This is how you build on a game's ending. Now you might expect based on how I'm setting this up that Dragon's Dogma 2 walks backwards, and it does, heavily, because it retcons the living shit out of it. This time around, the cycle of an Arisen replacing the Seneschal is just gone. The cycle is only composed of the Arisen taking down the dragon. Now, don't get me wrong, I did not like the ending of the original. It made the world feel senseless and dead, with the sole purpose of it existing being to perpetuate the cycle of Seneschals. In Dragon's Dogma 2, with the Pathfinder having to directly intervene in some cases, it showed that their power to shape everything in the world is not absolute. This immediately made the world feel more alive, because it could be driven by complex motivations that extend beyond just the Seneschal, but the retconning breaks everything down. In the universe, there's an unseen entity in the form of Oblivion. No, not that one. That destroyed countless worlds until some greater will decided to stop that. It created the dragon as a derivative of Oblivion, imprisoning it within a cycle where Arisen served the purpose of postponing the end of the world, which raises questions as to how are dragons created. Previously, if an Arisen were to lose to the Seneschal, they would be transformed into a dragon. Now, I guess they just exist. That's already contradicting, but the dragon overall makes less sense. Why does he offer you the choice to sacrifice someone and willingly walk away when his purpose is to destroy? In the original, the sacrifice made sense. It was a test of bravery and duty, and failing it would mean that you don't get to be the Seneschal. Dragon's Dogma 2 keeps the same decision but changes the context in a way that doesn't work. And if that's not enough, I remember talking to a guy who is also an Arisen and failed to beat the dragon because he was too weak, implying that he fought the dragon, failed, and yet the world remains undestroyed. But the final secret act is also a bunch of nonsense. The Unmoored world as a section would make sense if it were set up as a trial for the Arisen, much in the same way that the Everfall was designed as late game content. But it's not, and the Pathfinder makes that very clear. And yet, he also gives you the choice to return back in time in case you miss the opportunity to get to the secret act. He even talks as if you would take his place by confronting him, which you don't. And then it's also implied that he's the same dragon at the end when you break the cycle, or maybe he's this weird pot underground. Who fucking cares at this point? It feels like there's nonsense after nonsense hurled at you, breaking the foundation that the original set years ago. I get that the excuse is that it's a parallel world, but it doesn't make it a blank check that lets you change everything. The need for consistency is essential to tie these games together and make something that narratively works and resonates with players. It's thoroughly unsatisfying as well, because breaking the cycle was a subject that became important in the original, which is what happens here, except that you didn't put any effort into doing it. It feels undeserved, and it doesn't help that it's not even the same idea of a cycle, really. It's like a different director got control over the project and decided to do something else entirely. Dragon's Dogma 2 has been thoroughly disappointing in this regard, not just in terms of the ending, but the story overall. It feels lackluster as a continuation of a game that has been 12 years in the making. But we are not done just yet. It's time for part 8. As a principle, I try to stay away from promotional material and interviews because I want my experience with any game to be organic and surprising. But after I was done, I did come across some interesting posts implying that Hideaki Itsuno, the game director, may have not been fully sincere in his interviews, with some people going as far as likening him to Todd Howard, the lie boy of 76.
16 times the detail.
So I decided to investigate and... Oh boy. The first thing I noticed was about the affinity system, and I personally can't wait to get into that again. Can you feel the sarcasm? They wanted to create more detailed NPCs, people who act in accordance with their own goals in the world, and for the world to react to their actions that apparently they can take on their own. They also wanted characters to develop relationships with one another. And at this point, I too am curious about what game they're talking about, cause I can tell you which one it fucking ain't. Now, I do want to clarify that it is possible that some stuff is lost in translation, like they wanted to make an affinity system between NPCs, as in, they wanted to, but they couldn't or wouldn't. The latter interpretation would be a bit disingenuous, as it would go against the idea of actually promoting the game. Either way, this stuff is not here. It's a lie that is as obvious as soon as you talk to any of the hundreds of NPCs that do nothing but populate the world. 1,000 NPCs with unique stories and motivations? Bitch, where? Then, this entire thing about NPCs making their own decisions, what are you talking about? I haven't seen a single NPC decide anything on their own organically. Furthermore, the relationships NPCs have are not because of the affinity system. Brant does not dislike the Queen because of the affinity system, he dislikes her because he's written that way. To say that this sort of stuff is the result of a complex affinity system is just disingenuous. The only thing that is true here is that fights between NPCs can break out because of you, but it's the weirdest interaction in the entire game. If you reach max affinity with some characters, they will follow you around, and if you bring two to your house, they just start fighting out of nowhere. It's a really strange interaction, and I've no idea why this is highlighted in this interview. It looks like a joke. Hideaki also mentions that the world is designed to be reactive to what you do. In a sense, I get that there sometimes are consequences to you choosing to do certain quests, and others happen to be tied directly or indirectly to some of them. But does the world really change significantly enough to say that it's true? Do you even have, really, the ability to choose? As I mentioned, in the later half of the game, the idea of choice is not really there, and the finale also makes the decisions you've made at the start irrelevant. It's the sort of stuff that makes it difficult to tell whether what is exactly promised is actually delivered. The entire thing about NPC choice and affinity is certainly deceptive. The idea of choice, however, may not be fully so, but it does seem exaggerated. Oh, here's one of my favorites. In the video about pawns, Hideaki mentions how a huge complaint they had was about pawns saying repetitive things, and they focused first on that? There are also interviews where he mentions more varied armor options, but from personal experience, most of these seem to have been reused from the original. Bizarrely, he also mentions that they've added helmets and capes. These were there in the original. This, I think, highlights a problem when it comes to translating Japanese material. It's unlikely that Hideaki doesn't know that they were in the original, he might have meant something else. It's an issue that actually goes beyond just interviews and sometimes affects games from Eastern countries. Dark Souls itself often suffers from things being lost or changed in translation. I also want to clear a misconception about travel within Dragon's Dogma. In an interview with IGN, Hideaki states, "Traveling is boring? That's not true. It's only a problem because your game is boring. All you have to do is make traveling fun." And everyone clapped. Here's where I think a disconnect is highlighted. Traveling is not that deep when it comes down to it. It is fun to explore because they added more places worth checking out, but it's not fun to run constantly into monsters. It would be more fun if there were noteworthy encounters, but there aren't. Here's the real tea. Traveling isn't fun. Combat is. I can't really overstate how right they got combat and how vocations and pawns play into it. It's really well done. But the moment the need to travel overpowers the need for fun through combat, that's where things become annoying. And that's pretty much all I could pinpoint as deceit as far as I've noticed. Of course, you've got more ambiguous stuff, but if I were to nitpick, I'd be here all night, and judging from the amount of pages I've written in this script, I have already lots of work to do. Conclusion, part deux. Dragon's Dogma 2 is a game of extremes. I found it difficult to pinpoint an overall enjoyment to my experience because the game goes from, oh, I really like this, to hey, I really don't like this, to oh, I really like this, to hey, I really don't like this. And that's not because I really wanted the game to be better, if anything, it plays against it. But I do have to be honest and say that combat, for as big of a part as it plays in gameplay, is exquisite. It has layers that work together well to make it fun and engaging, from big stuff like vocations and pawns to smaller details details like elemental damage, unique enemy weaknesses, and the myriad of quality of life improvements, but when I look at the state of everything else, it's sad. The game doesn't capitalize more on its unique questing perspective. Huge chunks of the game feel rushed or simply not there. Its affinity system is laughable, and the story takes such a strong nosedive it's damn near tragic. It's physically painful to say that Dragon's Dogma 2 suffers from the same problems as the original, and it's ironic to look back at my previous video where I said, I did not need different races, I needed characters with actual personalities, only for them to add more races and do a marginally poorer job on characterization. Part of what makes this so much more painful is vision. The idea that it could have been so much better. Maybe not to the extent that it would be revolutionary, but at least to be able to deliver a more solid experience that doesn't rely on combat being fantastic. I think myself, as well as many of you, were sold on Hideaki's vision all the way back when he was talking about the original. We wanted to see this vision realized and improved after all these years, but unfortunately what we got simply doesn't do it. And it might seem rather mean to say, but after experiencing the game to the point of getting its platinum trophy, if this is the realized vision of Dragon's Dogma, then maybe it wasn't that grand of a vision to begin with. And that's all I have to say about Dragon's Dogma 2. Thanks for watching all the way through. I hope you understand where my grievances with this game come from. I'm genuinely not trying to just hop on the hate train with this one, it's just my genuine experience playing the game. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed, and see you next time. I'm not completely sure what I'll review next. I've been thinking of Rise of the Ronin, but then again, this is a small channel. I do have to be considerate in picking stuff that is hot to grow. What I'm trying to say is, support smaller creators, and have a good one.